Josh, the floor is yours.
All right, thanks, Sasha. Um, Good afternoon. I guess it's afternoon where I am anyway, to everyone. Let me just point out at the outset, if you see a JT Quinter in my screen, that is actually my son. I did not change my name. He was on here last and unfortunately didn't realize that till I logged on this afternoon. But welcome to our program. We've got about an hour today. I'm going to cover some ground to talk through delegation, why we do it, and ways to go about it that are effective. For those that have heard me speak before, you know that my MO is if you have a question or you have a comment that you want to make along the way, please feel free to do that. Don't feel like you have to wait to the end. I typically will leave a little bit of time at the end, but I find that it's much more productive and everyone, including me, gets more out of the program if we pause on a question or a thought at the time that you're having it. So if at some point you have a question or you have a comment or something you think that you'd like me to dive a little deeper, just take yourself off mute if you would, and don't be afraid to when I pause for a second to interrupt me and say, "Hey, what about this or what about that?" It's totally fine and actually very welcomed. The other thing I would say is if you're going to take notes, feel free to do that. Sometimes I'm not as quick as I'd like to be, but I will provide a copy of the PowerPoint deck if anybody wants that after the program. So, without further ado, let me get started. Let's see here. There we go. So at the beginning here, this is kind of an idea of what we want to think about when it comes to delegation. Um, Delegation is it's a relatively simple term when you just think of its definition. It's a very complex thing to accomplish, and a lot of that complexity comes from a couple different things. It comes from human personality, and it comes from complex organizations that sometimes can make it exceptionally difficult to accomplish delegation on a large scale. So we're going to talk through today. What's the point? Why should I delegate? Because there are some that say, well, why shouldn't I just do everything? Because then I know it's done and it's done right. So we'll talk through that. We'll talk about this idea of, can I delegate to my team? That's an important question because as you go through the process of determining whether to and how to delegate things that need to get done, you really should be doing an assessment of whether the people that you're working with that there is a way to delegate to them, and that those tasks are going to get done. We'll talk about what should be delegated, maybe what shouldn't, who you should be delegating to within that team, and what are some effective ways to make sure that when you delegate, that delegation is effective. And so, on a grand scale, one of the things that I've always tried to accomplish when I'm thinking through the delegation of tasks is, someone who's in a role that allows them to delegate work, what's their work? What's, at least from my perspective, what's their worst nightmare? What's everybody think about that? Anybody got a thought? So my worst nightmare when I delegate is one of two things or both happens. Number one, the person I delegate to makes a mess of it. And or number two, the work that I've delegated gets reverse delegated back to me. Sometimes because they've screwed it up and they don't know how to undo what they've done. So a lot of what we're going to talk about today in terms of effective delegation, is to figure out ways to make sure that when you delegate that work, it doesn't come back to you until it's done and it's done properly. Okay. So let's talk a little bit about what the benefits of delegation are. And anytime you talk about benefits, you should give consideration to the fact that there are drawbacks. As you can see from this slide, the benefits of delegation generally far outweigh the drawbacks. Now, there's an assumption in that, and that assumption is that the delegation is appropriate and done in a good way so that it's effective. If you were to change that to benefits and drawbacks of ineffective delegation, you would probably get a list that's either more equal, or you'd get a list that is has more drawbacks than benefits. But this makes the assumption that the delegation makes sense and that it's done in a positive way. So the benefits are, obviously, the easy one is you get to distribute work around. More work gets done because you have more people working on it. And, the folks that carry a lot of workload have less stress because maybe there's a little less for them to do, right? That's the obvious one. And that's the one that many, many people who want to learn how to delegate better are really out to achieve. Some other benefits include, when you delegate, if it's done right, you're putting everyone in your organization to their highest and best use. And highest and best use for each individual in your team or your organization creates some things that are good for the organization that we'll cover. A big one, particularly if you're in a leadership role, whether that's you're leading a small team, you're leading a division in your company, you're leading your company, whatever the case may be, is delegation is hugely important because it allows you as a leader the time and ability to step back, see the entire picture and oversee it, and then to look over the horizon and think strategically about the future. And that's a really important thing for any business to be successful. Another one is it provides an opportunity for folks in your organization to learn new skills. Now, the situation has to be right for that to happen, and we'll talk a little bit about that, but it is definitely a way to gain experience for people. And the other thing that's great about delegation is if it's done properly, it gets people invested in what they're doing, and they're more engaged, and they're more likely to want to be there and do a good job, and everybody wins when that happens. The drawback, particularly for people who are type A personalities, people like me as a lawyer, is you have to be willing to give up some control over process. When you delegate, you have less ability to control process. You certainly have the ability to demand certain outcomes, but that's a very important distinction. You have to, when you delegate, assume and be okay with the fact that mistakes are going to happen, particularly if you have the wrong team or not all the right people in your team, depending on what the situation might be. And I have found that delegation, where I talk to folks in some of my leadership consulting work that I do, what I have found is that the organizations that struggle the most with delegation and delegation-related things are those that don't have sufficient and effective communication. And I'm not talking about, red light, green light stuff like, okay, go, or okay, stop. I'm talking about larger conversations about what the organization's about, what we're trying to achieve, and things that are very, what I guess I'll call culture centric. So that's something to think about. You may create more problems than you solve with delegation if you're in an organization where communication is a challenge, and you might want to work on that factor first. So here's the kind of the answer to the why do we delegate question. Delegation allows for growth. Now, whether that's your team, a subset of your company, the individual, my experience has been that everybody wants to grow. And usually, if you talk to a company or an owner of a company or a leader of a team that expresses a frustration with the fact that the team or the group, whatever it may be, is not growing, is not advancing, is not getting better, it is almost always, at least in part, due to the fact that there is insufficient amount of proper delegation. And the reason for that is you have the same group of people carrying the load, right? It's the old 80-20 rule. What the old adage is, 20% of the people do 80% of the work. Well, that's okay to a point, but when your organization gets to a level where the 20% can't do the 80%, anymore in a timely fashion, it takes longer to get things done. You're carrying arguably dead weight in your organization, and at the end of the day, you don't have the opportunity to grow. Delegation is hugely important for purposes of growth. So what does delegation do to accomplish that? Obviously, it allows you to get more done. We talked about that for a second, but it adds experience to your organization, right? So it gives people an opportunity to do things within the organization that need to get done. And yeah, there's going to be bumps along the way. That's okay. But you need folks to have that kind of experience and to experience some of those bumps so that you can grow and you can make them responsible for more of what's going on. If you have, for example, I'll use it in the context of a law firm. If you have a file clerk, and all you ever let that file clerk do is take what's handed to them and run to the courthouse and bring it back, and you don't allow them to ever do anything else, well, at the end of the day, they're not going to improve. They're going to be stuck in that role unless they decide to leave, and they're not going to pick up any new experiences. They're going to allow you to give them more to do that will help your organization get more done. The next thing is when you structure it properly, what you're really doing is you're putting your team members in the best position to succeed. And as leaders in any organization, no matter what that level is, you always want to put your people in a position to be successful. You want them to work at their highest and best use, because if they are, they're more efficient, they're happier, and they're, as I said before, they're much more engaged. My apologies, my printer just decided to go off in the middle of my talk here. The other thing about highest and best use is that when you do that, when you find a group of people and you put them to work on the things that they're really, really good at, they tend to be very successful. And what that also does as a byproduct is it tends to eliminate what we all would refer to as busy work, right? So if you have somebody that is good at their job and there's nothing for them to do, we throw something at them that's just something to keep them busy so they're not twiddling their thumbs. And that's not a good use of their time, and it's inefficient. So remember, another way to look at it is what one of us may consider busy work, someone else's strength, right? So in many organizations, again, I'll use law firm as an example. Law firms use executive assistants. We do that for a reason. There's people that are really, really good at the tasks that are involved in that. They like doing it. And so you pay them nicely so that work gets done. That's not busy work to them. It may be to the paralegal or to the lawyer or to the administrator that's working in that company. It's not to that particular person, and they're good at it. So the idea is to eliminate that kind of busy work by giving it to people that are good at it and letting them do it and do it well. So the next thing is that growth in any company requires that leaders work on their business and not in it. So what that means, and that's not my original phrase, I borrowed that phrase from someone else. I just thought it was so well stated, no reason to restructure it, is that if you're in a leadership role in your organization, you have to spend time working on your company or on your team. And when you're in the midst of doing the work that the team does, you're not working on the business, right? This kind of ties back to the ability to sort of step back, detach, and be able to evaluate what we're doing. Is it still should we still be working on this? Is it pointing our team in the right direction? Are we going to be successful? Those kinds of things. Those are working on the business. Do we still have the right people in our team? That's working on the business. When you're working in the business, you don't often have time to pick your head up and do that. So delegation helps because it allows you to have certain members of your group have the ability to work on the business, which is absolutely essential for growth. And then the last one here is it creates an environment for creative solutions. So when you delegate and you do it effectively, what you are doing is you're giving somebody else the task who's going to come at it probably from a slightly different angle, and have different ideas about how to deal with it. And if you delegate effectively to multiple people in your organization, you know, it's sort of like a diversity argument, right? Whether you're for diversity or not, it doesn't matter what the folks look like. What matters is you have different perspectives and different life experiences. And when you delegate to people in your team, no matter the situation, they bring certain things to the table, certain experiences to the table that may cause them to think about the issues differently. And what that does is it brings new ideas into your organization. Any questions on any of that? Okay. So how do you build the right team and to make delegation work? This is that idea. You may remember on the first slide, I asked the question, can I delegate to my team? Right. So here's sort of some tips on what the team should look like and how you build that team in a way that allows you the opportunity to delegate and perhaps over time delegate even more and grow. And this is all on scale, right? So if you do it very, very well, you can grow very, very fast. If you do it reasonably well, you can still grow. So there's a direct correlation to how well you do this piece to your ability to delegate, and then a similar direct correlation between your ability to delegate and your ability to grow. So where do you start? Within your group, you need to have people who are brave and who are go-getters. What does that mean? You need to have people who are self-motivated and who are not afraid to make mistakes. Does that mean that they are cavalier and they just go do whatever they want? No, it doesn't mean that. What it means is you want somebody that's willing to take on the tasks that you give them, is motivated to go ahead and tackle them, and is not going to be so timid so as to reverse delegate everything back to you because they get into it and they go, I'm not sure what to do here. You need somebody that's willing to make a call. And when you have somebody that's willing to make a call, they're not necessarily going to get everyone right. So, I think you got to start with that as your basic baseline. You also need to understand the skill sets that your team needs to be successful. And every team has them, and not every teams are the same. So an important point here, what got you where you are today may not be what you need to go where you're going, or what you may need once you get there. So you have to do sort of a regular assessment of your team and figure out what the skill sets are you need in the present moment, what the skill sets you might need over the horizon are going to be. And then you need to figure out, do I have that in my group, or do I need to get them? So a good example of this, I don't know how many people watch the show. It happens to be a favorite of mine because I'm a soccer guy. The show Welcome to Wrexham. But the last season of it sort of demonstrated this point very, very well. They were able to advance up the soccer pyramid in Britain, 3 levels in 3 years, and every year they had to reassess: do the players we have, are they the players we need to be successful in the league that we're in now? And it forces you to have to make some hard decisions. And at the end of the last season, which I just actually happened to finish watching about a week ago, they had to say goodbye to some players, and they said goodbye to them because they made the decision, look, you helped us get where we are, and we're very appreciative of that, but you can't help us where we are now and where we're going. And there's a certain amount of, in soccer, professional soccer, they call it a certain amount of ruthlessness, but that's probably too harsh a term in most corporate settings. But there has to be some realism in your decision making, right? Sometimes we really like people, but if they don't have the skill sets you need, you have to be willing to reassess and say, okay, do I have the right people in my team so that I can continue to delegate things? Once you get the right people, you got to get them in the right seats on the bus, right? So the analogy here is it doesn't do me any good as a business owner to have 16 people who can drive the bus. I don't need 16 drivers. I only need one, right? That's part of the bullet point above. But once I get them in the bus, I got to get the people that I have there with the skill sets in the right seats. So if I hire an accountant, I can't ask them to do legal work, right? A good example of this, I once had an experience where the firm I was working for, I needed a little help on a piece of litigation. I was working in court, and they sent me a wills and trust and estates lawyer who was a very, very good lawyer, excellent person. I loved them, but had no skill set to do what I needed them to do. They were put in the wrong seat. They needed to be in a different seat so they could be put to their highest and best use. So get the right people and then get them in the right roles. Then build an up or out culture and only promote the right people. So what does that mean? Certain people will have all people will have ceilings. The question is, where is the ceiling? And as a general proposition, culturally, if you have people in your group that are not able to perform at a level that allows them to move up, at some point you have to say, do we have the right people? Now, does that mean that you should be firing people all the time? No, but it means you have to be realistic about it and say, okay, I've had this person, go back to my prior example, who's been a filing clerk for 10 years and is showing no compunction about wanting to learn anything else, and get any better at anything. Do I keep paying this person who gets a raise every 2 years, or do I move on? And so that I can find a way to build somebody in that role that can take on more work and that I can delegate. Once you get a situation where you can promote people from within, you then have to help those folks understand that when you get promoted, you're not responsible to do that job anymore. You're responsible to lead the people who are doing the job. And you need to make sure that they understand, and you need to teach them how to delegate themselves. The natural instinct of anybody or most people who get promoted is, well, what got me promoted was being really, really excellent at my job. So rather than delegate those tasks to somebody else to do now, it's easier for me to just do it. I'll show them exactly how to do it. And that's not what you hire them to do. You can't delegate what you need to do as the leader to them to do if they're so engaged in doing the job they used to be, as opposed to overseeing that work. And that may sound a little bit like a difference without a distinction, but it is most definitely a difference when it comes to organizing and running your organization. And then the last one on this slide is, obviously we talk about accountability all the time, and you need to build accountability structures. But those accountability structures, in order to make delegation work within your team, have to be set up in a way that it's not exclusively reliant on the team leader, right? So the idea is, if everybody's delegating and doing a pretty good job, but there's one person in your team that when anybody on your team delegates to them, it all falls apart. It should not be left exclusively to the leader to have to deal with that. Part of the point of delegation is the ability for people to get things done. So there needs to be some cultural element to what you're doing so that others in your organization understand that you can hold someone accountable when work gets delegated to them, because that is their assignment, because that is their highest and best use. Any questions? Okay. Next, we'll talk a little bit about delegating the right things to the right people. So as is probably unsurprising to most people, it's usually a good idea to start with thinking through, what needs to be delegated. And that evaluation, the mistake that is often made from my perspective, is people begin to think through what they want to delegate based on the tasks that they're working on. I'll use myself as an example, a made up example. I've got, let's say I'm working on, 5 or 6 briefs in the moment. I've got a lot due in a short period of time. And so I go, I don't know if I can get all this done. I'm going to have to delegate some of it. Well, I'm making that decision and thinking about that issue from the perspective of what I'm doing in my business at the moment. That's a snapshot in time. Now, that might provide you with some temporary relief, but it's not going to solve the problem from a long-term perspective. When you evaluate what needs to be delegated, you need to do that from a leadership perspective, meaning take the step back, look at the organization as a whole, and ask, perhaps in that example, the primary question, which is, how did I get into a situation where I had 5 of these due at one time or in a short window of time, and not have enough lead time to get it all done? Am I trying to tackle too many cases at once? Is this case that I'm working on not staffed properly? What are the issues? Now I'm working on the business or on the team or on the project as opposed to working in the moment, and dealing with what the action items are that need to be done. And oftentimes, when delegation falls a little short, as a systemic approach to things, that's where it falls apart. Folks will say, well, I delegated this, and this, and it worked for a short period of time. And then all of a sudden it didn't work anymore. Well, that's because you dealt with the exact issue that it was in front of you, which is the 5 briefs that were due at this moment, and not the larger issue of how you got to the situation where you had 5 briefs basically due at the same time. So make sure that you think through it, and that you think through both that element, which is the causation, and the timing, right? When do you delegate the work is a leadership question. It's not a management question. And those are 2 different things. In my first example, I'm managing the problem, which is 5 briefs due at once. In the second approach, I'm taking it from a leadership perspective and saying, okay, how do we get in that situation? How do we better organize and delegate things so that we don't end up having 5 due with one person having to do all the work, in a matter of 3 days? And how do we delegate those out from a timing perspective and to the right people so that we're not overloading the other people that need to help, and we're giving them sufficient lead time to get it done and done well. Obviously, the second bullet point here is almost goes without saying, but sometimes that makes it even more worthwhile to say out loud. As part of your evaluation process, you need to determine what work is not can't delegate it. There's a number of reasons why something might not be something you can delegate. Sometimes it's a matter of it's a unique, for example, a unique client relationship, and you just can't delegate it to somebody else because that client won't deal with anybody else. Sometimes it's an ownership issue, meaning something's gone sideways and the person who's working on it is the one that really kind of screwed it up and needs to fix it. Could be that. Could be a lot of different reasons. But be sure that you've thought through it, and if you're not going to delegate it, that there's a very good reason for not delegating it, because it's very easy to go through a list, for example, of 50 things that need to be done, and convincing yourself as the decision maker, none of these are really, I can't really delegate any of those. And what does that look like? You refuse to give up control of any of the 50, and you delegate smaller, discrete tasks that go to each of those 50, and therefore you tie the person who's doing the job's hands, and you tie your own hands because they're going to do a certain part, and they may not do it the way you wanted it done, which would create your ability to do all the follow-on work in that task. Sometimes it's better just give the whole task to them and be done with it. When you delegate, delegate to the highest and best use, to put the people you're giving it to in the best position to succeed. So this is my example from earlier. Don't hire an accountant and ask them to do legal work. It doesn't work. Don't hire a carpenter and ask them to weld. That's maybe a little bit a different example. So to get the right people in the right seats on the bus is great, but if you put them in the right seats on the bus, and then you put the accountant, for example, in the accountant seat, and then you say, okay, well, he's in the right seat, he's sitting in my accounting department, let me send him some legal work. You're in the same boat. So you got to make sure you understand what everybody's highest and best use is. And does that mean that everybody's going to be doing work that's in their highest and best use all the time? No, but you want to maximize that as much as possible. Now, when you talk about it at that level, one of the things you have to necessarily consider is, do you have the person in your team that can do what needs to be done, that needs to be delegated? And this is quite frankly the reason why outsourcing companies exist. Um, this is not an ad, this is not a campaign to outsource work. But the reality of it is that sometimes, depending on what it is that you need to do, it there are whole industries that have been created around the concept of outsourcing and providing skill sets to a business that they do not have under their own roofs. So anytime you outsource, there is, of course, a question of whether we should hire somebody to do this full time and just put them on our payroll. And part of that analysis is there enough of this kind of work to do? And usually the differentiator that I encourage people to look at is, if you have enough work to keep one person busy doing what you were about to outsource, then you probably need to hire somebody to do it. If it's a part-time, it would be a part-time job, and somebody whose highest and best use is that task you're about to outsource is going to need 50% of their plate filled with work on from somewhere else. You probably should just continue to outsource it until that need grows to the point where it makes sense to hire. And when you have to delegate to the highest and best uses we talked about on a prior slide, you do have to evaluate, do I have the right people in my group? Sometimes it's not, the answer is not outsourcing. Sometimes the answer is you need to hire, right? You're looking over the horizon, you're going to need a specific skill set. You may need to hire. And anytime you hire, you also have to look at the opposite side of the equation, which is, if I need to hire somebody to do this job, is there another job, not that has to be, that should be eliminated, right? If there's somebody who's doing a job that you don't need anymore, that's equally as important to address as getting somebody to do a job that you need done. Because if you have somebody that you really, really like, you've known them for years, they've worked for you for a long time, and the skill set that they originally brought to the company and did a fabulous job for the company and for you doing is no longer needed, unfortunately, it's probably not a good idea to keep them around. That's not a highest and best use. So you just have to be realistic about that, and evaluate it in a way that is fair, and allows you to, you still got to treat people like human beings, but at the end of the day, you got to make the best decision for your company. And if you don't make those decisions, you make it very hard on yourself to delegate. Now you're left in a situation where you have to delegate busy work because that person doesn't have the skill sets you need to do the work that needs to be delegated. Moving to the next one, as I said, try to avoid delegating busy work. We don't need to belabor this. You're going to have to do it some, right? There are going to be occasions where there is some busy work. It just needs to get done. And, Joe sitting over there in the corner, who's really good at his job, has some downtime, and you're just going to have to give it to him, right? Because it's got to get done and you can't get it done. Now, it's usually a bad idea to dump all the busy work on the same person all the time. And when you delegate busy work, that's okay, but try to make sure that's not all you delegate. You want to try to make sure that the work you're delegating, that the person who you're delegating it to feels that work is meaningful and is contributing to the ultimate outcome. If you're constantly asking someone to just process paperwork that they don't think has anything to do with this company ultimately being successful and is not really a part of their job, that person's going to get frustrated. Their efficiency is going to go down, and you may even lose them because they're going to get frustrated. The next one here, this one's really important. It's not always easy to do. Find opportunities to delegate work that will allow employees to take on something new, but do it in a setting that doesn't kill you if it goes sideways, right? There's no harm in delegating work to somebody that you actually know there's a 50-50 chance they're going to get it wrong. And, as long as when you look at that work and you go, okay, I'm delegating this as much as anything to give this person an opportunity to see how this works. And you have to be okay in that point of saying they may fail, they may not get it done. And how do you do that? You evaluate, if this person fails at this task I'm about to delegate to them, is it going to kill them or is it going to kill our company? If the answer to both of those is no, it's not, go ahead and do it and give them a chance. They still may get it right. They very well may do the right thing, make the right outcome occur. They may not, but at the end of the day, at least at a minimum, if it doesn't work out quite the way you wanted it to, now you have an opportunity for learning and for growth, and you can sit down and have that conversation with that person and say, okay, where did this go wrong? Let's debrief it. And now you've started to prepare them to do that skill down the line, perhaps when it is more meaningful. And you can feel a little bit more comfortable about delegating that skill to them or delegating that task to them. And then the last one here is, be flexible. It's not a one size fits all. In some cases, delegating something to Mary may make total sense, and in another case, delegating that same kind of work to Joe might make more sense. Just because it worked once doesn't mean that you should do it that way every single time. What's an example of that kind of a scenario? Mary does an excellent job, and she was working on something for a client. It does really, really well. And the client is really, really happy. You have another similar situation, but it's a different client with a completely different personality, that you just have a sense that Mary's not going to jive with, and the client's going to not get along with her. So you may choose to use somebody else. Now, Mary may not care. Mary may care. Mary may come to you and say, why didn't you give me that work? And you just have to be prepared to say, look, different situation, same kind of work, different situation, has nothing to do with you. It's just, how do we put everybody in the best position to succeed? So you just have to be, there's no set structure or group of rules. If this, then that every time. If this last time, then that. If this time, is it still that, or is it something different? So you just have to be willing to be objective about it and look at your situation. Some additional things to keep in mind. One of the big issues with delegation is sort of the chicken and the egg argument. You have to be able to delegate in order to make more time to do things. Unfortunately, to do delegation well, it takes time. Right. So there you have it, the chicken and the egg. What you have to do is to prioritize. Okay. There are times where there's no reason, because of the prioritization, to make time to delegate and sacrifice getting some things done. Conversely, there are times when, there's things to get done, but it should not take priority over setting aside some time to sit down and figure out, what do we have here, what needs to be done, and how can we delegate it in a way that makes us efficient, and allows us to get more done. I wish I could tell you there was some science to that, but it is much more art, if you will. And I think it just takes a little trial and error. But I can say one thing about that line item definitively, which is, if you don't ever take the time to sit down and figure out what needs to be delegated and how, you will never have the time that delegation creates. So it can become a vicious cycle where people just say, I just don't have time to sit down and figure that out. I just got to keep going. Well, what you're effectively saying is, I don't have time to work on my business or my team or my group. I only have time to work in it. And what you're effectively conceding at that point is, I'm happy with where we are. We're not going to grow. We're not going to get better, because we don't have time to do that. It's just an unfortunate outcome that comes with it. Another thing to keep in mind when it comes to delegation is, we talked a little bit about the 80-20 rule a little while back in the program here. There's another, if you want to call it that, another 80% rule that is worth keeping in mind when you're the person who's trying to delegate. And that is that, someone else's plan that gets you 80% of the way where you want to be is better than a plan that's 100% correct and never gets executed because you don't have the time to do it. So oftentimes what happens is people who don't want to delegate or are unwilling to delegate, whatever label that you want to put on it, when you get down to the bottom of it, the part of the reason that they always give you is, well, that person's not going to do it right. So you have to dig a little deeper, and sometimes you have to be honest with yourself or whomever you're talking to, you're trying to encourage to delegate, and say, is it that they're not going to do it right, or is it that they're not going to do it the way you would do it? So, that's a there's a difference there, and the reality of it is that a lot of times the work that needs to get done never gets delegated and done because the person who could have it delegated to them and could get you 80% of what you need, which is probably in the end, in a lot of circumstances, going to be good enough, never gets cut loose because it's not 100% of what the person who's delegating would really like. And from my perspective, 80% is better than nothing. A perfect plan never executed is useless. So you want to keep that in mind when you're delegating. And does that mean just delegate for the hell of it, and expect that everybody's going to hit 80%? No, you got to keep in mind everything we've talked about today. But at the end of the day, letting somebody else who's competent and who may not follow the same process that you would, but get you 80% of the outcome that you're looking for, is a better outcome than sitting on it and not delegating it, waiting for the moment that may never come because you don't have the time, right? So consider it this way in dollars and cents. If the plan I have is designed to make me $100,000 and I delegate it and it gets me $80,000, isn't that better than not delegating it, sitting on it, and never getting even a dollar because the plan never got executed? I would argue that the 80% is a better solution. The next one here, we talked a little bit about this, so I won't dive it much deeper. It is a common thing that when you promote people, they usually get put in charge of people who are doing the job that they used to do. And so you have to remind them that you need to be able to, you're promoting them because you need to delegate certain things off of your plate to them. And they don't have the time to do the job they used to do anymore. They have to figure out how to let those people and manage those people to do that job so that they can do what you need them to do. That is often a breakdown in organizations when promotions happen. And sometimes it's a natural transition and it gets resolved. Sometimes it doesn't get resolved because it never gets addressed. I think part of the messaging on that is, try to keep the person who's been promoted a little more focused on the macro, at least in the short run, and a little less on the micro. You don't want them in the office micromanaging the people who are doing the job they used to do. You want them thinking about the bigger picture of what those folks are up to and what the objectives are. The next one is a huge one for me. When you delegate, it is exceptionally important to take the time to explain why that delegated task needs to be done. Nobody cares why you're delegating it to them most of the time, right? They don't need you to say, I'm picking you because you're special or because you're the best or whatever. What you need to do is to say, look, I need you to do X. And the reason I need you to do X is because it's going to help the team accomplish this goal by accomplishing this end, and explain that why, explain what the purpose is. The reason for that is because, number one, it allows the other person to engage with their own process and develop their own way to get there. And if you can get people to do that, most of the time, they're going to be much more committed to the outcome than if you say, this is what I want you to do. This is how I want you to do it. This is when I want you to do it. Now they're just execution. That typically causes people to be a little less engaged. And then when it doesn't go according to the exact plan you've given them, guess what they do? They come back, they reverse delegate and said, you told me to do X, Y, and Z, and it didn't work. And this is where it's off. What do you want me to do now? If you want them to engage and to tackle the problem, tell them where you're going, why you're going there. Then they will come up with their own process. within, you can set parameters, high level, don't lie, cheat, and steal. Um, and cut them loose and let them do it, and then hold them accountable. And when you do that and you explain why you want them to do it and why it's important, guess what? When they hit problems, they're it's not, it doesn't eliminate it altogether, but when they hit problems, they're a heck of a lot less likely to come back to you in a reverse delegation situation. They know where they're supposed to end up, and they figure out a way to navigate around the problem that they're dealing with on their own, which is the whole point of delegation. Let someone else do the task and get the outcome so that you can focus on something different. Another thing to keep in mind, when you delegate, there are going to be mistakes. As I said before, it's okay as long as they don't sink you or the people in your team or the team as a whole. Now, sort of an overarching element to this is, when you delegate, the people to whom you are delegating need to understand and feel, literally, that you trust them. If you give it over unwillingly, if you give it over with reservations that they can sense, if you give it to them and you kind of say to them, I don't think you're going to be able to do this, but I'm going to try it, you're not setting themselves or you up for success. They have to believe that you believe they can get it done. And that's really important, because trust is important in any organization to have success, to operate successfully. And when you delegate ineffectively and the people to whom you're delegating believe that you are basically assigning tasks as opposed to asking them to get a job done, it decreases trust and creates inefficiencies and lots of reverse delegation, because people then tend to cover their own backside by coming back to you when something doesn't go according to plan, instead of saying, my boss trusts me to get this done, I'm just going to get it done. The next one, keep in mind, there's an old phrase, you should always be training your replacement. This next bullet point kind of plays into that. And basically, keep in mind that someone in the list of delegees that you're sending work to is probably your replacement. And what that means is, you want to let them into the decision-making process. You want to let them have the experience of having to run down these problems and these tasks on their own and in their own way, so long as it's, again, within proper bounds and they're not breaking any company policy or violating any laws, that kind of thing, doing anything unethical, then, let them do it. And sometimes they're going to do it and they're going to fail. And that doesn't mean don't give them, guidance and thoughts. But at the end of the day, let them do it, and let them learn from what they're doing. And sometimes that'll be positive reinforcement, because what they do works, whether it's what you suggested or something different. Sometimes it's got to be negative, because they're going to try something that they think will work and they have to learn that doesn't work. But in order for somebody to be effectively your replacement, they have to learn how to do your job, which means you're going to have to delegate some tasks that are important for your job to someone else to do, so that they can begin to learn them. Similarly, unless you're the owner and there's nowhere for you to go that's up, you should be looking to do the same with whoever's above you. Ask to have work delegated to you if you want to be promoted. Ask what you can do to make their job easier by maybe taking some things off their plates, because that's an opportunity for you to take delegation and for you to learn what works and doesn't work. And then the last one here is, you gotta hold people accountable for outcomes. And this one is another one that gets jumbled a lot, and there's a big difference between holding people accountable for outcomes and rather than process, right? When you delegate to somebody, if you want to do it effectively, you should not be dictating process, not in fine details. It creates as many or more problems than it solves. And since you shouldn't be dictating process, you shouldn't be holding them accountable on process, because if somebody comes back to you and says, for example, that the outcome, let's just say, to make a really simple example, you say, I want you to do this. I want you to accomplish this task. And the goal, I'm going to hold you accountable. If you don't make me $100,000 on this, there's going to be, we're going to have a discussion. I'm holding you accountable. That's an outcome. I haven't told them I'm holding them accountable for how they do it. If that person comes back and they've only made you 70, okay, well, hold them accountable for that. And let's have a discussion, explain why, understand why, and make some decisions based on that. But if that person comes back and says, hey, you wanted me to make you 100, I made you 200. Are you really going to question the process? Probably not, other than to say, hey, let me understand what you did, because maybe I should do it that way. So if you're okay with the process, if it does better than the outcome you expected, why are we going to get overly concerned about the process when it doesn't? And some people say, well, because if the process, if you failed, the process obviously failed. Yeah, maybe, but you don't want to discourage people from solving problems. You want them to learn from their mistakes, but you don't want to hold them accountable for bad process. You want to hold them accountable for bad outcome. And then you give them feedback on the process that might be helpful so that they don't repeat the mistakes they made before. Because maybe the process was good and the execution was bad of the process. Maybe the process was bad and the execution was phenomenal. So it doesn't mean process doesn't matter. What it means is, if you're going to be successful at delegating, start with outcomes. And if someone, for example, continues to use the wrong process repeatedly, okay, well, now you need to address that. But don't get so lost on insisting on your process that you forget that what we want people to be accountable for are outcomes. And in order to delegate effectively, you have to let them explore the solutions in a creative way that allows them to be efficient, allows them to engage with their work, and gets them invested in the outcome that you want them to have. And if you can do that successfully, guess what? People will take on more work. They'll be glad to have you delegate things to them, and they'll be more successful. They'll get more done. Your job gets easier because you can delegate. So I think that's the last slide. So that brings us to a close of the presentation portion. Does anybody have any questions or comments? Just going to look in the chat here. I see that there's some stuff in here.
I thought it was very practical, Josh. Teresa and I were kind of going back and forth a little bit, talking in the chat uh, throughout your presentation. But honestly, all the things as you're presenting them, it's like, oh yeah, that's common sense. But so many of us get stuck on so many of those points. I know I did personally for a long time. So
Yeah.
I thought it was very helpful. Today would have been helpful for me a couple of years ago, but I'm getting there. I'm getting there. But no, it's good stuff because we continue to grow, and that's what I think is the really cool takeaway too, is it's going to force you to grow, and that's only a positive thing. So really, I just think it's great information.
Well, thank you. And look, I think growth creates this natural conflict within people, which is, okay, well, I've been very successful to get where I am. How did I do that? By doing what I do very, very well. Okay, well, that's great. Is that what it's going to take for you to get even better and even further from where you are? Maybe it is, but most of the time it's not. And just as a sheer volume of work, even if you were to continue to try to do the same things over and over and over again, as you grow, you can't multiply yourself, not biologically anyway. You can hire people to do more of the same things that you're doing. So it's to your point, Sasha, it is a never-ending battle that I think anyone that is in a position that requires delegation has to be conscious of the human nature element along the way because for me I am the one that I struggle with in all of this the most is the process piece that I talked about there at the end. I am an attorney. I am a type A person, and sometimes I have to correct myself and say, whoa, 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 wait a second. Why do I care about the process if they got the outcome that I needed? Right. So this lawyer went about it a different way than I would have. It completed the right outcome. Why do I care about the process? It doesn't matter. You break the law. No one got sued. No one got hurt. We're good. Let's move on.
Josh, that's one of my new famous sayings. Just because it's not your way doesn't make it wrong.
Yeah. Yeah, I have a similar refrain that I've said in front of many a judge, which is just because it's an answer they don't like doesn't mean it's the wrong answer, right? Which is a similar sentiment to what you just expressed, for sure.
Yeah. So
Travis put
I saw that. Yeah, I saw this was recorded. I'm assuming you're going to send the slides, but Josh, I'm going to reach out to you individually to potentially redo this with my leadership team, if that's okay.
Yeah, that would be great. I would welcome
I
that opportunity.
invited them, but we had a bunch of stuff going on today, so I couldn't get anybody else on. But would certainly like to redo this with the team.
Okay, that'd be great.
I am here, Teresa. I did
Oh,
join, and I
Ah,
felt a lot, I felt a lot of slaps on the face. I'll tell you that.
Josh, I don't know if you saw in the chat, Travis put a valid point in as well. Many times people don't delegate because they don't want others to get credit. And that happens more
True.
than people not delegating for fear that someone else will screw it up.
Yeah, I think Travis is right about that. So the question, the trade-off becomes, is it more important for me to get credit for this task, or is it more important for me to grow as a human and the organization to grow for my benefit, right? That Travis, I think, is part of the classic owners, what we would call the owners or the founders trap. A lot of times with small businesses, you have an owner that has grown the company into something that's just fabulous, and they don't want anybody that might come along behind them who might be able to take credit for things that says, oh, well, maybe the owner or the founder isn't necessary anymore. So they're afraid, as you suggest, to let other people do things because then they might have to give up credit and people might start to look at them in their own mind and go, do we really need this guy anymore? So it's a great observation. It's a great observation. Okay. Well, thank you everybody for taking the time to listen to me today. Hopefully you got something out of it. I will send the slide deck to Sasha so you can circulate it to everybody that was able to make it today or that was on the list and couldn't make it for whatever reason. And if you have any reason to ask any questions or you want to talk a little bit more about the subject matter today, feel free to reach out. My information's right there on the screen.
Thank you, Josh.
thank you, Josh.
Thanks, everybody.